Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what promises to be a thoughtful and stimulating conversation. I'm Stavroula Golfomitzou. I'm Head of Collections at the Getty Conservation Institute. Today, we turn our attention to a topic at the heart of museum and archival practice, access to collections. Together with 4 distinguished colleagues, we will explore how each of them defines access within their institutions and examine the complex balance between expanding access, ensuring long-term preservation, and embracing sustainable practices. We will begin by considering what we actually mean when we talk about access, who is included, and who might be unintentionally excluded in our decision-making. How have our professional roles evolved over time? And what kinds of compromises are we continually asked to make? Access takes many forms, and as professionals, we hold real agency in shaping it. In exhibition spaces, for example, the decisions we make about lighting, environmental controls, or the use of display cases can determine not only how objects are preserved, but also who can or cannot experience them fully. Conservation measures may limit tactile engagement for visitors who are visually impaired, while display heights or case designs may unintentionally restrict visibility for others. Interpretation also plays a crucial role. Gaps in curatorial or conservation information can affect how audiences understand and connect with objects. And then there is the vast realm of storage. We know that the majority of museum collections reside out of sight. In recent years, however, we have seen innovative models from the Depot Boymans in Rotterdam to the V&A East in London, bringing the public into storage spaces and offering new ways to view and even interact with collections. While the idea of open storage has existed for more than half a century, only a small number of institutions have adopted it widely. Opening storage offers clear benefits. It supports the democratization of collections, allowing access beyond researchers and curators. It provides meaningful educational opportunities, especially for communities whose cultural heritage is held in museums. It enhances institutional transparency and reveals the often invisible work of museum operations. But these opportunities come with substantial challenges. Open storage requires significant resources. Spaces must be safe for collections and accessible for visitors. Handling increases risks to objects. Interpretation is often limited. Security constraints remain, and the financial investment, whether in new construction, retrofitting, or staffing, is considerable. Many storages are located off-site, adding yet another layer of complexity. These are the tensions, opportunities, and responsibilities we will explore together today. So I look forward to an engaging discussion with our panelists and with all of you as we consider what meaningful, equitable, and sustainable access to collections can look like in the years ahead. So we're going to begin today's session with a short presentation by Wayne Modest. Wayne is the Director of Content for the World Museums, spanning Amsterdam, Leiden, and Rotterdam, and he also serves as Professor of Material Culture at the Free University in Amsterdam. Wayne's work is widely recognized for its depth, critical engagement, and impact on the field, and he has contributed extensively through a remarkable body of publications, including Matters of Belonging, Ethnographic Museums in a Changing Europe, Museums and Communities, and more recently, Spaces of Care that you can download for free from Transcript website. His scholarship consistently challenges and expands our understanding of museums, heritage, and the roles they might play in contemporary society. So before I invite Wayne, I would like to ask you to silence your phones and also to remind our audience over Zoom to put their questions in the Q&A box. Thank you. Wayne?
nervousness. Normally when I'm nervous, I sing, but I'm not going to sing today. Thank you, Pula, and thanks for the invitation to be here and to be here on these lands to present. My presentation will be from me, and I will name myself now a Jamaican who moved to Europe, and now a European, a Dutch person working in museums. And my presentation is on a series of concepts. At the end of the day, all I want to say to you is that we need new concepts. We need new concepts. My presentation is also on failure, and that idea of failure is for us to be less afraid to fail and to make our failures productive so that we can imagine different kind of possibilities. In 1976, the National Gallery of Jamaica recently opened, tried to lend 3 amazing Taino sculptures from a museum in the UK. It was the first time that Jamaica, an immediately post-emancipation, post-independence country, was trying to, oh, I didn't do that. Yes, was trying to do a survey of Jamaican art. The loan request was refused, and the refusal came for 2 reasons. One, Jamaica did not have the conditions, the necessary preservation conditions, which will help to keep those objects forever. And 2, Jamaica could not provide the insurance necessary for that kind of loan. Of course, the people working at the National Gallery were very disappointed. Such an event uncovers, tells us a story about the complex entanglement between the question of the colonial and the question of preservation. The question of how colonial entailments, the ways in which, or the coloniality of our understanding of what is preservation, what should be preserved, how we should preserve, was enmeshed in how objects moved. Then, fast forward to the 2010s, and now I'm in the Netherlands. I'm in the Netherlands in another kind of museum, a museum that is called the Wereld Museum. Vula said world, but it's Wereld Museum, pronounced funnily. And a museum that is committed to a different kind of understanding of what museums could be. We are a museum that does not necessarily believe only in the sacredness of objects or in the idea of objects to be kept in perpetuity, but rather a museum that was committed to an idea of a just and more equitable world. What might it mean that our preservation practices, that our museological ambitions are about justice and equity? What might it mean that the collections that we hold in our museum are there to fashion what we call, or I called, critical citizenship? What might it mean that we imagine our museum to push against the protracted ways in which colonialism continues to ensnare us in the unequal distribution of rights, of responsibilities, but even the unequal distribution of life chances? What might it mean for us to put our museums in the service of being just? This was the challenge that happened to us as a museum when in 2013, well, when I went to the Netherlands in the first place, one of my first big words when I moved to the Netherlands, which was at the end of 2010, was budget cuts. In Dutch, it's called bezuiniging. It was a great word to learn. And I learned that word because there was a crisis in the cultural sector, and certain institutions like my own that I had moved to might have been closed. Some people narrate that closure as simply a closure based on budgets. Others narrate that it was just too colonial to keep. that we were in 2010 being required to forget the colonial. The institution itself had emerged as the Colonial Museum and therefore was a kind of evidence of Dutch colonial and imperial pasts, and therefore, why keep it? There was one political leader or political party that said they would not mind if it were to go back to celebrating the colonial, but any museums that is critical of the colonial, they're okay with it disappearing. That led not only to an anxiety about the possible closure, but it opened up a set of opportunities for us to ask, what might a museum of the future look like in the Netherlands at that time that was in what I call the conjuncture of the colonial, deeply embedded in a struggle to try and understand what it means to be Dutch, what it means to be European, when we take account of our complex entanglement or role that we played in colonialism. We merged 3 museums, and in the merger of those 3 museums, we created the World Museum as a museum in a funny way, in an interesting way, that was going to be critical of how colonialism continued to animate our contemporary lives, but not just stuck in the question of the colonial, to imagine what a different kind of museum could look like. And I put here a quote by a famous theorist of mine, Stuart Hall, who would describe this as a conjuncture. It was a moment of anxiety, a moment of threat, but also a moment of opportunity to imagine what different museums could look like. That moment of conjuncture was a moment when museums across Europe were embroiled in a conversation about their relevance. Why did they exist? About the questions of the colonial, the coloniality of their form. And I just give you examples here. You know the one in the middle probably, which is the one on the Met, which is an institution called Decolonize This Place, an activist formation that was criticizing museum. But on the far right, an activist who had walked into one of our museums, spent 20 minutes walking around and narrating a kind of anti-colonial rhetoric which posed the question of us as a museum when he walked out with the object, who is the thief? Did you steal it as a museum, or can you describe me as a thief? I must admit, for you all in the audience who are conservation specialists, and don't tell anybody I say this, we were kind of ashamed, I was ashamed anyway, that he could have just walked into the museum and walked out with the object. But that's another story altogether. The question was, how do we understand statements like, it was legal at the time, when Ndiabanza was saying, but the law at the time was racist. The law itself at the time was a part of the problem of why we could have that object in the first place. This is what I call the conjuncture of the colonial. A moment so embroiled with tensions, discomfort, rethinking, reorganizing to try and understand how do museums like ours attune ourselves to the fact that much of what we do was embedded in a colonial genealogy. Out of that came a few books. That one on the right recently came out. This is not an advertisement, but you can buy it anyway. In that book, I deal with a concept that the title is around, which is called productive failure. And it is a title that we, together with the authors that are there, have taken from activists who, working with us, have been saying to us, you all can't just sit down and stay there as museum and not do anything. You might fail again, you might fail again the third time, but failure is not enough to not try to commit to justice. And so that changed our practice. But one of the most significant thing in relationship to this. And we started in 2014-15 already to think about what access might mean. We had large-scale debates. This event on the left is one day full of 400 people just discussing what heritage might mean for them. And I had a day of about 1,400 mostly young people, discussing what should museum do with the colonial? How should they deal with it? And they were just debating and debating and questioning and critiquing us. But it was this project on the right, Decolonize the Museum, organized by 3 young women activists, that challenged everything that we were to think of as what the museum could be. They challenged us by writing text in our introductory gallery. And when they wrote the text in the introductory, in the entranceway, we said to them, for example, text should only be 1,120 words. And they say, no, we want to write 400 words. We have said, you can't say this or that. They say, no. Once you're going to collaborate with us, we must have the right of collaborating. They wrote text to accuse us as a museum of being racist, of ableist, of sexist. One of the texts that they wrote was literally next to the front of house staff when they said, we came into this museum and they were racist against us. But as young people would do, which was quite fascinating for me, anyway, being a kind of old man who didn't know Twitter at the time. And so we decided they wanted to publicly do this, and we said, okay, we said we were going to collaborate, so go ahead and do it. And we were so afraid. I had stomach ache for 2 months before this event. And they decided to do all sorts of tweeting, and then our marketing manager said, if they tweet, we're going to tweet as well. A negative tweet, and we do a positive tweet. I would suggest to you that that event was mind-blowing. One of the first and biggest examples for us of what productive failure looked like. We did not tweet. We did not respond. We allowed them to be able to be critical. And what that did for us as an institution, it developed a kind of understanding internally and externally as a museum that this is a way to build trust. And today, I would like to suggest to you that 2 of our museums, one in Amsterdam and one in Rotterdam, when I just came to the museum, the average person who came to an opening, and I'm going to be, forgive me if I'm incautious here, was a white person of 55 years old and over. Today, the average person who comes to an opening in those 2 museums for us is between 35 and 45, and they just look beautiful. It created the condition for another kind of museum where access was not just about we being gatekeepers, but we were co-constituting the idea of what our programs would look like, what our exhibitions could look like, and what even visits to the storage depot would look like. Out of that presentation, we've created a policy in the museum called Community Matters. And in the Community Matters project, as a part of our commitment to redress, we have 3 modes of community work. One mode of community work is when we when we create a program and we invite a community to participate. Then on the far extreme is when we just provide the funding and the support, and we say to them, go ahead and do what you want to do. And we just deal with what the consequences are. And then in the middle, we have one where we co-constitute the community collaboration together. That kind of project has kind of shaped us into a different kind of institution that, for the most part, is committed to an understanding of what it might mean when a museum engages in the politics of the present. And when that politics of the present is about the redistribution of rights, responsibilities, recognition, but also resources. I'm going to close. This is how we define decolonization. And I'm going to close by just showing you a few pretty pictures and a series of projects that we've been doing, because I wanted to leave these words with you. Decolonization, we just defined. We've been teasing out the idea of trying to use the word preservation a little less and use the word care a little more. And one of the reasons for that is that my 1976 story about that UK museum is a story about preservation, keeping objects forever. Today, our conversation around collections is not about keeping objects forever. It is about how can a museum commit to the flourishing of community and community life, which might mean that restituting an object is more important for the community's future than for us to have it in our storage in perpetuity. How might we reorganize our idea away from preservation towards critical care? But that requires epistemic humility, understanding that our knowledge is only one in a series of complex entanglement of knowledges. It requires a different kind of orientation to decolonization, because one of my problems with the museum as form is that right now it has become evident to me that how we define museums as ethnographic, as design, as fashion, as this, as that, continues to order the world in a hierarchy of value. Art museums are places where Europe and America sit. Ethnographic is from those countries far away. The ethnographic actually is an afterlife of the colonial inequalities that were set in place during colonialism. This is a project we did on Words Matter. And this Words Matter project was dealing with the fact that we need new concepts. So a part of that is, and you can download this, but please don't download it because we are revising it right now. But a part of it is, what do these terms mean? When we use these terms, what are they saying? Why do we use the term gay or gypsy? What is at stake in those terms? And this was never intended to say to, because when we did this, we were accused very much of trying to rewrite history, rewrite vocabulary, or take vocabulary away from people. And I'm Dutch, and I can tell you, Dutch people don't really like it when you tell them what to do. But what we were saying to our staff is, no, if you use the word tribal or tribe, you need to know why you use that word. If you use the word Indian, you need to know why you use that word. And there are some words that we just don't need to use anymore. It was a little bit of a catastrophe, but it was very popular. And a lot of institutions now use it, probably more than we do, to be honest with you. Because sometimes I see something slipping and I thought, oh, did we read our own text? But a lot of institutions are now using that. And it includes 54 words, concepts that we suggest should not be used anymore. And since we wrote this book, our collections department has been using it to also look at our database and in the words that we use in our database. So we're using it as a process of decolonizing the terminologies we use in our exhibitions. But we also have conventional practices of engagement and open storage and inviting people in to rethink the collections. And I want to close with these 3 images. These are part of what has been happening recently in the restitutionary moment that we inhabit right now. And if anything else, what restitution has pushed us to try and understand as a museum is that we are still complexly entangled with an unequal distribution of heritage rights and heritage objects. And that even as much as we say that museums in Europe are of the people and for the people, and that they are for humanity, and that we keep them for all of humanity, unfortunately, almost every one of the humans there in this picture had to get a visa to come to Europe to come and see the collections. And therefore, visa regimes are also a part of that colonial entanglement where we in the Netherlands can travel anywhere we want, almost, in our slippers, flip-flops. But most of the formerly colonized world need to get permission to leave their country to come and see their objects in Europe. What might access look like when these colonialities continue to enshrine certain unequal rights? And I'm not suggesting as I close that all objects should be returned. I don't think that will ever happen. My dream, however, is that perhaps the people in Peru or in Nigeria or in Jamaica might get some Rembrandts and Brancusis there in exhibitions. And perhaps we will all go to Benin to see a Benin exhibition and contribute to their tourist economy than every single time in the past when I wanted to do an exhibition in Africa. It was easier for me to ask European Museum for collections and never an African country. Museums of today, in terms of access, must contend with the unequal distribution of heritage rights. They must be committed to a politics of redistribution, of dignity, of the rights to see and be, but also just to enjoy a little joy in front objects as well. Because today, most of the world cannot do that. Let us make conservation not a limitation, but a possibility for imagining more joyful, joyous, livable heritage futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would like to invite our panelists, Wayne, of course, Joe Horse-Capture, who is Vice President of Native Collections, Chief Curator, and Amundsen Curator of Native History and Culture at the Autry Museum, Lourdes Ramos, who is the President and CEO of the Museum of Latin American Art, MOLA, in Long Beach, here in California, and Russell Rivank, who is the Head of Conservation and Preservation at the Getty Research Institute.
Hi, everyone.
So, thank you. Is everything? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, great. So thank you very much, Wayne, and thank you all for joining us. It's an exciting day for me. So I'm going to ask, I have only 3 questions, and then we hope that you will ask questions to our panelists. So I'm going to ask from you, Lourdes, and ask you how does your institute define access to its collections, and what specific measures are you implementing to broaden or improve that access, whether through opening or rethinking storage areas that I know you do, expanding display strategies, advancing digitization, or developing other collection-based initiatives?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your dissertation, very enlightening. Well, as you know, MOLA is the only museum of Latino and Latin American art accredited in the United States. Talk about decolonization, a very, very straightforward process with a lot of requirement. And then when we talk about conservation and the storage and how people have access to this collection, right now, I have to tell you a long story short. We are working with the Institute Museum Library Service to put together the digitalization of the MOLA collection. But further, we are working in the next generation for MOLA as a 21st century museum with the colonization process in mind, with an open storage concept in mind, and let's see the video about the future of MOLA.
We were invited to dream big, beyond the limits of our imagination, and we stepped up to the challenge. We dared to reimagine MOLA, to dream of what the future of Latin American and Latino art could be. This year, we take that vision and put it into motion, because the time for imagining is over. The time for building, expanding, and transforming is now. MOLA's legacy is no longer a promise. It's a movement, a living force that celebrates creativity, honors identity, and connects our community to the world. In Los Angeles County, in the heart of Long Beach, California, where cultures meet and stories intertwine, stands a museum unlike any other. From Southern California to the canals of Venice and the skyline of Dubai, MOLA has carried Latin American and Latino art to the world. Each exhibition and collaboration reaffirms the transformative power of art to move us forward.
And now, that vision we've reimagined is taking form. While building a legacy, we've built a dream team of architects, consultants, specialists, and our world-class partners, turning MOLA's expansion into more than an architectural project, a declaration of purpose. We are designing a museum that is sustainable, inclusive, and immersive. A place that will carry Latin American and Latino art into the future, transforming how art is preserved, experienced, and understood. Designed under LEED principles, leadership in energy and environmental design, the new MOLA will embody greener, more efficient, and environmentally responsible construction. A place that honors the past and makes room for what's next. Let's reimagine MOLA and keep this legacy in motion.
So we are in the first phase of the capital campaign, means the silent phase of the capital campaign. This is a $75 million project. We work with 33 countries, and we have a constant interaction in different ways, especially through digital and everything that have to do with access in a very exponential way. But the future is about be more participatory in the physical real time, have more hybrid programs, and obviously work with everything that have to do with inclusion and diversity, things that we do right now. Well, but that go in the golden hand with the economy of the museum. That's, as you know, many museums in the world, but right now in the United States are in struggle. for different reasons, especially for the political context that we are working right now and all the federal fundings that are cut in the museum field. Say that the future is work in a golden hand with the community. The museums are for the community, the museums are for the people, and they should be part of the legacy and how you're building up a more effective communication, more effective participatory work with the users, not the visitors, the users of the museums.
Thank you. Joe?
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for taking your time this afternoon to be here. For those of you who are not familiar with the Autry Museum of the American West, you're welcome to come. It's just down the hill from here. It was founded in 1988 by Gene Autry, also known as the Singing Cowboy. And a lot of folks think that the museum is about Gene Autry. In fact, he wanted the museum to tell the story of the American West. And we have taken it sort of the next step of telling the story of the diverse West, which we're doing with our exhibitions and with our programs. In 2003, the Autry merged with the Southwest Museum. And the Southwest Museum, which is LA's first museum, has one of the largest collections of Native American objects in the country. Well, they closed, first of all, during the Northwood earthquake. It impacted the facility and also for finances. So we absorbed their collection. So now we have the second largest collection of Native American objects in the country outside of the Smithsonian. Once we absorbed that collection, we had to make a place to store them, which we call the Parks Resources Center. It opened in 2022, $32 million building. So for us, it's the question about access is a little challenging to answer, because at the end of the day, you can divide our collection into two very simple categories. One of them is non-native material, and the other is native material, which is the vast majority of work that we have. And so with native material, it proves to be even more complicated. In 2022, the Autry made a management of native collections policy that emphasizes the importance of tribal consultation. And then, of course, we have NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, which was first passed in 1990, then was updated in 2024. And the update is really, really critical because it has a part of duty of care, which means museums have to obtain free, prior, and informed consent from lineal descendants, tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations prior to allowing any exhibition or access or research of cultural items, which is Native American material. So what that means is, although we had established it in 2022, it's been re-emphasized by NAGPRA in 2024, is to have access to our Native American works, one needs to get permission from Native tribes. So for example, if you want to come into the museum or write to us to look at Cheyenne material, Southern Plains, right, Oklahoma, you would need to have a letter from the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer to do any type of research or any type of looking at collection items. It's something that we had for a number of years, but of course NAGPRA makes it even more official, I guess one would say. So that does a couple of things. First of all, and sort of in the same spirit of what Wayne was saying, is there's a lot of tribal folks that don't live in Los Angeles, who have never really had access to the items their ancestors made. And what this policy and NAGPRA does is it says, well, just because you live in LA or you're a museum person or a researcher, whatever the case may be, it doesn't mean you automatically have access to everything. It gives priority to Native people first by putting in a mechanism for them to grant permission in order for people to see it. So it's prioritizing Native voice, which I both professionally and personally think is, although at times it certainly can be challenging, I think it's, at the end of the day, I think it's very, very good because it ensures that these works are being taken care of in the best way that we can, both by who has access to it and also by how we treat the items.
Thank you. Rachel?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be in conversation with you all. And thank you, Wayne, for the thought-provoking presentation. Just a general thought before I tell you about what my institution does. I think oftentimes people think of preservation and access highlighting the tension between the two. And it is true that if you put something on display, it might be in the light and get damaged from light. If you have people handling it, it might get wear and tear or even damage. But to me, the tension is in the now. It's not in the long term, because preservation is never about what you said, like forever. It's never about forever. It's about balancing access in the now and access in the future for whatever future generation will be coming after us, but not denying ourselves or communities now access either. And I think conservation can be a tool, a support to do that. I think conservation should not be the gatekeeper. It should be the enabler, hopefully. So as the Getty Research Institute, the GRI, we're on this campus. We're a library and archive, so that means things are accessed a little bit differently than a museum. I think, in fact, Vola, you mentioned the V&A East Storehouse at the beginning. I got the chance to visit them. It's an experiment in radical access where visitors can walk through the storage areas and they can request to view things. And that approach is inspired by library and archive. So the way we put things on view, there's exhibitions and loans that we support, but very much also the reading room where anyone can really request to see material. They might be asked what is their reason, but there is no gatekeeping. It's more for informational purposes. It's not vetting. And so I feel like as conservators, what we do is really supporting access from the moment of acquisition, where we might do triage treatments to enable handling and digitization, legibility sometimes. Where I had an example of architectural drawings that came with the Paul Revere Williams collection that was completely crumpled. So the treatment was aimed at unfolding the drawing so the information could be legible. With support to the reading room, we do a lot of training to our staff to teach them how to handle things responsibly, things like that. I'm sure your institution is doing too. So that's the kind of thing we do to support access. And I would say there's a dimension of access which is, to me, a bit more than simply the collections, but that's also access to knowledge, access to the institution, access to these mysterious behind-the-scene activities, and we do that too. We do a lot of outreach. For example, a workshop that we've put on for several summers now that is co-organized with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, NAMAC, because we are co-steward of the Johnson Publishing Company archive, is a workshop that is geared towards students from historically Black colleges and universities to introduce them to conservation and other fields as potential career path, but also give them the opportunity to spend time with the archive, to handle the archive, to learn what it takes to acquire, digitize, process, curate, conserve such an archive, And it's not like the inviting radical critique like the experiment that Wayne was saying, but it's still opening these processes to wider audiences and taking on board that their feedback, I think, is important as well in terms of access and transparency.
Thank you. Wayne?
I promised that I wasn't going to just criticize conservation. You know, I live in, there are multiple levels of access in relationship to our kinds of collection, and I think Joe mentions that. On the one hand, we are not an art museum, we're an ethnographic museum. We're not a library and archive, which means, therefore, that much of our collections are drawn, very many of them under the colonial period, were acquired, and from other places. So there is also a difficulty in terms of access of the communities from which the objects came for that. So there is that, and we're constantly working with thinking about what that might mean and how we do that, whether or not it is digitally, or more recently we've had projects where we, in support of our restitution program, we've invited communities from certain areas to say, come and look at what we have as an institution. More recently, we created a new data hub where they can find all of the objects related to a particular cultural group. So there is that. So there are many ways in which we are trying to deal with that access regime. But I still feel that we need to acknowledge that that the limits of certain past inequalities makes that difficult. So that's one thing. Two, I mean, we do also, and that's what I meant with the young citizens, post-migrant citizens in the Netherlands, that we also try to open up for them and say, okay, you are a citizen, but your heritage is also a part of our museum, so you also have that right. My colleague Cindy is sitting right there. She's an amazing head of our department for collections, but one of the things that we did under her regime was to implement a collection service system where we have people dedicated to ensuring that anybody can ask for access and it is addressed. It doesn't all work easily, but it is still addressed. That said, I still want to hold out the possibility that conservation needs to do more. I still want to hold out the possibility that in the discussions recently around restitution, conservation still has been one of the limits to the possibility of restitution, because we live in a kind of moment where we still have ideas about relative humidity and temperature, but also the idea of the capacities of people to care for collections. Those things still animate our discussions, and it might not be a question of perpetuity or foreverness, but we still hold on to a certain kind of heritage regime in many museums which prohibit us from thinking that a community's flourishing might mean that they dance, they have joy with an object that is going to disappear, and that might be more important. So I think that we need to contend with the fact that that it is not just conservation facilitating. I agree with you, and we are all thinking about that. But one of my favorite scholars, Ariel Azule, she says if we are to decolonize the museum, we need to decolonize the world. Because outside of the museum are the strictures of restriction that also restrict the possibility. So we still have this idea that we need to develop people's capacity to care. And that there is something that we need to think otherwise about. It centers us as the center of capacity, of knowledge, of knowing. So I agree that there are many examples of us doing good, but I come from a different regime that doing good is not enough, because we have to acknowledge that the limits still are in place that governs the unequal distribution of rights or of value of knowledge even. So, is that all right?
Yes, thank you. So Russell, I'm going to start from you now. how are museums balancing the need or desire for broader public access to collections with the responsibility for long-term preservation? And in what ways are emerging climate action policies, such as the BISO group's expanding environmental parameters of 40 to 60% relative humidity, reshaping sustainability practices in collections care? And to what extent can access and preservation truly coexist? And where do institutions draw the line when these priorities come into tension? And yes, please start.
All right, so I guess I'll start by saying that BISO is really squarely aimed at museums. Archives and libraries have different approaches, but to not respond, but continue on what Wayne was saying, I think it certainly has these, conservation has evolved as a colonial discipline. That's how it was born. That's the countries it was born in. So there is no doubt about that we also need to acknowledge that and get over that. So there is certainly a risk and again of gatekeeping and using and there's a great scientific knowledge that's been accumulated, how we can reconcile that with, at the same time, decolonizing, opening, not using this knowledge as, again, keeping people away or keeping objects from being restituted to the communities they originated from. And that's a big, if it was easy, we wouldn't be here talking about it. So there's no doubt that is a great challenge. And I think, but one of the elements of BISO and similar initiatives in archives and libraries is to say, okay, we can't, we took these objects from countries where there was not HVAC, there was no such tight parameter, but now we're using these conservation recommendations to prevent them from being loaned or restituted to these countries. So there's obviously like a huge discrepancies there. And I think where there can be a sort of, I agree with what Wayne said, like we can do good, but we should do better. So I think the idea of continuing the scientific investigations of like, well, are these really harming objects is one thing, but also sometimes saying, yes, we don't care. That's not the point, because I think there is also an element of conservation where we try to understand like, what is this object? What is its purpose, its essence? Is it, does it have a spiritual meaning for a community? Is it an object that's supposed to be in use? Is it supposed to be admired from afar? All these objects are going to have different ways to be approached. And I think once you understand, this sort of like inherent idea or spirituality of the object itself, then you can have a response that's adequate and not, again, not saying, no, we can't do that, but opening it up a bit more.
Thank you, Wayne.
No, yeah, one of the things that I think struck me with what you were saying was the question of science and the scientific evidence. So we had a big project recently called Pressing Matter, which was a project on just rethinking what provenance research means, what restitution means, what the core concepts around these keeping objects mean. And one of the key concepts that we were thinking about is value, and what values objects have or hold, and how these values can be different based on the different lenses through which you look at these objects. So, I have objects in my collection where we would have to acknowledge that for a community, these are not objects, they are ancestors. That is in my museum. As another museum might think of those objects not as within ancestrality, but they are thinking of it for its scientific value. And so we were trying to push ourselves to ask the question, which one of those values do you need to balance when it comes to question of access? And for whom is that important? So we always give the example because we are a museum that is complexly entangled with the colonial. So we had a race biology lab, and we had a lot of ancestral remains in our museum. So we also had to struggle with the idea that there were many communities that were saying that these are my forefathers. And whereas in the Science Museum, they were saying that it is a scientific object. So how do we come to an understanding of value? And for us as a museum, that is embedded in an idea of value for life. What does it mean to think about value for futures, indigenous and other futures that have been catastrophically broken through the colonial? And within that then, when we start doing that balancing or thinking about that, then it is not simply about keeping or not keeping. I want to move away from thinking the object and its materiality. And I want to think about how do I make that decision together with communities about what that object might mean for them, whether or not it is preserved or not preserved. Because I want to make even the decision about access together with them, rather than just making the decision of what access might look like. But I also don't want to dominate the conversation with the ethnographic, because there is a way in which a lot of the things that I've spoken about is about museums with anthropological, ethnographic, whatever. And I think that in many ways, these conversations are, I was saying earlier, are also conversations that art museums have. I really like your presentation because it is not about the ancestral in a way, but when you look at the history of my kind of museums, there were very few art museums in the Netherlands, but in Europe, that ever collected modern art from Africa up until the 1990s. It is as if Africa had no modern, had no 20th century. So what we do as museums, we have them historic, and then we jump to the contemporary, and all of the 20th century disappear from Africa, from Oceania, from the Americas, from Latin America. And so for us, these objects, even just a question around modern, of what it means to be modern, is also a question of how do museums participate in that dignity work, by also allowing people to be a part of helping you to shape the narrative around how histories are told, what objects are acquired, how objects are displayed, what stories are told. And I think that that is as much as a conversation for the art institution as it is a conversation for the so-called ethnographic, because to live in these categories is to live in the colonial, in my view.
Thank you, Joe.
I think part of it is, of course, what I mentioned in the beginning, NAGPRA and our native collection policy. Similar to what's been said before, I think getting your head around, at least for the works that we have, and which is an area of my specialization, Native American works, is nothing was meant to last forever. You know, everything has a cycle. And museums, I'm a second-generation museum person, so it pains me to say this, but museums are not natural, right? They're non-Western cultures don't have museums back in historic times. So they're very much of a Western thing where we need to visit the other, collect from the other, to capture that moment in time, then bring it and ensure that that moment in time, that time capsule, if you will, is preserved for all of eternity. And in my mind, for what it's worth, I think that's a very non-Western way of thinking about things. No, excuse me. It's a very, I said it backwards, ironically. It is a Western way of thinking about things where items, objects, were not meant to live forever. Having said that, there is a certain amount of respect that we try to give to these works. For example, it's a bit of a challenge because we're so tuned to using this type of language, is we don't use the term storage. So after we're done today, I'm going to go home, say hello to my cat, change into my casual outfit, I'll take my shoes off, I'll put them in the box, cover them up, make sure they're polished, put them in my closet, and close the door. They're in storage. It's because they are inactive. Where Native American works are always active. There was a time and a place when these objects were made, and this person would develop a relationship with, let's say, a bag or a shirt or moccasins, whatever the case may be. And with some belief systems, when you take these items and put them over here because you went to go do something else, you miss that. It's like, where is that at? I don't feel right unless I have it. And in reciprocal, that item doesn't feel right unless it's with you as well. So when you use the term storage, we objectify what it is. It becomes just a thing, as opposed to it's, for many, my experience, from many Native community perspectives, it's more than just a thing. In a way, it's, I hate to say a living being, and I hate to say a spiritual thing either, because I always makes me think of like dream catchers and flutes and those kind of things. But it has something to it, which we certainly try to respect. Also with handling, with many community ways, they're gender sensitive. So some works can only be handled by males. Some works can only be handled by females. Of course, we don't know everything. So when we have folks come in and visit us to look at our collection, they tell us. It's always a constant learning thing.
Thank you. Lourdes?
Well, it is a very complex question. We can be here years talking about this, and everybody go to have their own vision about the conservation and everything that we have to take in consideration. But I think the difference is marked by the kind of collection that you handle. Obviously, it's not the same in our collection that an archaeology collection, on and on and on. And also the market, in the case of the art collection, make a huge difference. The art market is a very, very strong indicator about the process of colonization and how we can impact the culture of any place in the world, any artist in the world. And that have a deep repercussion in the way that we build in this institution and the approach that we make to each object in each institution. But at the final of the day, at least from my point of view, is about the memories and how you can establish a dialogue with the user, how you can bring knowledge to the user, and how you can make sure that, for example, in the case of Mola, we have artwork from Venezuela, we have artwork from Mexico, we have artwork from Salvador, for say, some countries that many of them came from a rescue process because of political fights in the different countries. So I think that's a value that museums still have in place, this value of rescue, of make sure that objects are good take care in a good environment, but further than that, who write the history of these objects? How you make the interpretation of this object? Could be artwork or could be any kind of objects. I think that's, at least in the case of the museum, as an art museum institution in these days, more than ever, is a high consideration. Either the DEI, everything that is not able to be in the public arena system is something that we still working with in a very exponential way, because at the final of the day is the history of the human being translate in a pictorial or in a three-dimensional object.
Thank you. So it's the third question, so I'm going to ask you all to be a little bit short so we can get some questions from the audience as well. So the last question is, in what ways can conservation practices actively enable or facilitate greater access to collections? And how should institutions navigate the trade-off between increased use along with what comes with it, the risk of deterioration, and the resources required to mitigate that impact? And what is gained, what is lost, according to you? And who ultimately holds the authority to make these decisions about acceptable risk and stewardship? So I'm going to ask you to start.
Last November at Yatri, we opened up an exhibition called Creative Continuities, Family, Pride, and Community in Native American Art. And I think that exhibition, which we started in 2022, I think is a real good example of sort of all these different perspectives coming together. So we worked with 3 community members. John Pepion is from Blackfeet, Jessaray Growing Thunder, who's from Fort Peck, on Montana, Brocade Stops Black Eagle, who's from Crow. And we worked with them. They came, selected the objects from our collection with conservation, and they provided commentary, what they thought the themes would look like. I recorded them with their permission, of course. And then this recording, the transcripts, ended up being the labels of the exhibition. So the show is about 90% their voice. Some spots, curatorial sort of had to, step in to sort of make the bridge between the other ones. Also, conservation worked hand in hand with many of the what I would call curatorial consultants for the exhibition. For example, the Crow, located in South Central Montana, they have their big annual event every year, which I believe is the 3rd week of August. Everybody's welcome to show up. It's called Crow Fair. And it's like 3-4 days of parade, powwow, rodeo, the whole works. It's really a great time. And for the parade, they have a tradition of dressing their horse in regalia with beadwork and everything, and the riders do the same, and they parade, they have contests, everything. So for this exhibition, we had to find a mannequin horse, which one would think that would be easy, but in fact it was a little bit challenging. And Brocade came a few days early, worked with conservation to install to dress the horse, because it took several days to ensure that everything was done right, both from her perspective as a curatorial consultant, a member of the Crow tribe, as well as somebody who parades, and also balancing the needs of conservation. So it's a combination of both historic works and contemporary works. And I think as I guess in this format, as a representative of the Autry, I think it's really a good example of how both conservation, community, and museum needs really came together. And lastly, is some of our conservation projects, our conservator, Lily, will work with somebody for the community. Like, for example, we have a couple of Dene textiles that need to be redone, and we'll bring a Dene weaver in to come in and fix them. So it's sort of figuring out what that balance looks like from both sides.
Lourdes?
Well, it's an ethical question, and things that goes in different avenues. The first avenue is the kind of staff that manage the collection. Is a change of profile. The curator is not anymore the one that tells the history, is the actual curatorial process, amplify the voice of the kind of lectures that you can approach different objects from the design point of view, from the technical point of view, for many different point of views. The same with the register. The register should be a more technology-oriented professional, and as we go by one, the staff of the museum, the profile of the staff of the museum change, and that go together in a golden hand for more knowledge from the side of the users. The users have to be introduced in another way to the conservation process of the work that we have in context. Sometimes we underestimate the users or the visitors, that's part of the process we have to engage in as part of the solution of the conservation of the object, and how we can manage in a better way the patrimony that we are taking care.
Wayne?
I hope I can be controversial, because then we'll agree with each other. We can't do that. You know, on the one hand, I think, and I'm going to contradict myself, conservation is important. It's important to also because objects should have futures. Conservation has a certain expertise to be able to think about what those futures could look like. Conservation also, there are so many in thinking about rescue, the role that conservation plays in helping some stories to emerge that were never told because of how history silenced certain stories. So conservation is going to be an important part of that. My question is not whether or not conservation is important, it is with what attitude, thank you, Sydney. With what attitude we come with conservation. It is about, and so for me, for example, I don't call us an ethnographic museum anymore as a category, but I believe in our practice of ethnography as a way of learning with others. And so the conservator, like the curator, must step back, not to tell, but how do we learn with, in a common commitment to a certain kind of historical, cultural future. In that sense, for me, I'm not trying to put aside conservation. What I'm saying, and I think that this is one of the things that we, as museums, when we come in face of activism, or when we come in face of decolonization, we think that we should just not say anything, or we should just step aside. No, we have a certain set of, I don't want to call it expertise, but expertise, which we've nurtured for some time. Some of it was wrong and wrong-headed, others it was good. And the question then is, how do we learn together, support community futures in a way which puts conservation in the service of, rather than it being the expertise that it is on top of. So what can conservation do? It is what I call that humility, that kind of humility, a practice of care, caring and careful, that would somehow help to make those futures that communities, people feel important, to open them for the possibility for the community itself to flourish. I'm interested in that kind of flourishing, and that's why one of the things I struggle with even the terms like diversity and inclusion, because I think that most diversity and inclusion policy fail because we suck politics out of them. It's for the happy, huggy. I think that's why, because I think we're all diverse here. The diversity is everywhere. The problem that we have with diversity is that institutions don't allow them to flourish. So I go into an institution and I suffer with so much racism, discrimination, this, that, because you don't like my diversity. That's why I'm interested in flourishing. So conservation's role for me is to support the flourishing of different histories, of communities, of marginalized narrative, to put it on equal footing with what we've come to know as self-evident. For me, that is what conservation can do.
Thank you. Marcel?
To follow up on that, and I am not going to disagree. So, yeah, this is beautifully said, so I agree with all of that. Something which is just a flat reality is these works are also institutional assets, and so as such, you know, we are under a certain pressure to preserve them for the institution, even when it contradicts sometimes what they are, what they want. So that's a reality. But that to your question, we'll have who would make these decisions. In some ways, I think it has to come all the way from the top of these institutions to take the kind of, you know, accept the kind of risks that it means to accept that an object might be ephemeral, or that the community will handle the objects and all of that. I hope that in all of this, conservation can be a resource. You know, there is knowledge there. I think we can, conservators can help achieve the goals, all of these goals, and can help object and people flourish for sure. And definitely the collaborative part is and the humility part is key. I think nobody becomes a conservator because they want to be in front of the stage. We usually like to be a little bit behind the stage, and we do our best work when we consult with other professions, with communities, with you know, whoever is needed to be in the room to have these conversations. And then just to I really liked what you said. You take great care of your shoes. I was very impressed, but I liked what you said with the shoe example. I mean, I feel like to be a conservator is to believe in the power of materiality, whether you frame it as a belief system, as spirituality, or simply as something very practical. And in a way, to be a conservator, you want to share these objects, not as image, not purely as ideas, but as objects. You want to pass them on for other people to share too, because they're witness, as Wayne was mentioning, they're witness, they're evidence, they're also joys. So I think that's why we want to pass them on. And that's what I hope we can help do.
Great, thank you. And now time for questions from the audience and the Zoom. Okay, yeah?
Okay, hi. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm going to frame my question as a dichotomy, thinking about access, but it's not truly a dichotomy. It's just for the ease of the question. I know at least a couple of the presenters cited some dollar figures for capital projects. I know that Getty is also undergoing capital projects, and I'm wondering if there is in fact any sort of tug of war, especially as it relates to funds between physical and digital access to objects, or funding of access to digital spaces versus physical spaces in your various institutions. Or if you find that at a top level there's equal support in tandem for both, and so maybe what the financial and maybe philosophical reality is at your institutions. And also just to acknowledge that that does not take into account access to spirituality, ancestry, intentionality, et cetera, and other types of access within the question. But thank you, that's for everybody on the panel.
I would like to start.
I think for us, certainly, if one had to choose, which I don't like to choose, but since you're kind of forcing me a little bit, probably most of the funds would go to preservation of works as opposed to digitization. The reason why, it's because we have a small conservation staff and a gigantic collection. So we need to stabilize the collection. That's our first priority.
In our case, digitalization, because we are in pretty good condition. We don't have too many issues with the conservation of the collection right now. And we serve 33 countries. I mean, obviously we serve everybody, but our mission as an institution is attached to our region, and we try to serve the region in the best way that we can, and then digitalization is knowledge and also transparency of the legacy that we have to preserve.
I think we're quite fortunate that we're not pressured to choose between both. Something that's interesting is that we found that when something is digitized and put online, it actually increases the demand for physical access, because I think people know it exists and they're more inclined to come see it. And then just as a general reflection, I think there is an important element in your question of, sort of like post-colonial equity. I know I know the colonial power that I will not name. You can, there's a few of them you can guess, whose National Archive was pressured to give back archives pertaining to previous colonies. And they made the choice to give digital archive, and that was not a very satisfactory choice for the previously colonized country. And so there's an element of the digitized is maybe like a surrogate to the physical that is not always equitable.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, we also, I'm not so sure that we never have enough money. Let me just admit that, you know, we always think museums. No, we are always struggling. I've never worked in a museum, I was saying earlier, where the collections were very well documented, even if there are 4 objects or 400,000, right? So we struggle with that as a starting point. But I would say in our museum, we just adopted a new digital strategy, and a part of the digital strategy was to serve access, because we recognize that access to communities locally in the Netherlands itself was important, but also access internationally to the places where the collections come from is also a starting point for physical access. So do we have enough money to be able to do that? No, but it is something that we want to invest in. And I want to just say that one of our capital projects is to develop a new storage area, and in that new storage area, sorry, Joe, I used the word storage. I didn't want to use vault, so in that new collection center, it is also trying to privilege spiritual, ritual, that kind of access as well. So we're also creating a space, or hopefully spaces where communities can engage through with that, which is much harder through the digital. And therefore, it is not one or the other, but both that support each other. And especially when communities of origin from where our collections come see the need to use the digital, for example, in their reviving of a tradition, in understanding what an object looks like. All of those things are a part of how we want to imagine it. To answer your question, it's not perfect though. Still a struggle.
Now? Yeah, thanks. So thank you so much. This has really been inspiring. You know, I wanted to actually ask all the panelists whether they are already observing a change in the way that conservators are being prepared to do their work. And I say that as a conservation educator and somebody very invested in community and putting young people into spaces where the community is, they are the experts. Yes, you have expertise, conservator, but sit right down because you don't have it all, you know. And what you know, Wayne said about humility, so I've actually published about that, humility and conservation, but I think it's, you know, I think it's, I would love to believe that we're talking a bit about something that's currently undergoing a bit of dynamism and change curatorially as well, you know, because each of you talked a little bit about your ability to facilitate other experts in museum work. And I feel like that's something that's happening in conservation too. So I just was curious if people would speak to that.
For me, definitely. I started my museum career at the Minneapolis Institute of Art in 1997. And conservation has, at least from my observation, I've worked at Minneapolis Institute of Art, National Museum of the American Indian, Minnesota Historical Society, now at the Autry. And I think over that time, conservation has certainly changed for the better. I think National Museum of the American Indian, NMAI, has a very, very strong conservation program where they work with Native communities. Certainly the Autry, as we go further and further into more Native exhibitions, working with community members through these exhibitions. The Autry conservation team, I think, is very, very good. So there's just through my eyes of 20-something years, it has certainly changed. I think, well, at least from my view, depending who you ask, from my view, certainly for the better.
It is before was more about chemistry and technical approach to the artwork, and I see every day more and more. It's a more hybrid vision about the conservation work in general.
Ellen, if you're asking me if I feel that conservators coming out of grad school now are way smarter and better prepared than I was when I came out of grad school, it's a resounding yes.
How do I follow? I'm interested in pedagogy, so I'd love to talk to you after, because I'd actually love to see if we could try and do a little project to study conservation syllabuses for over the last 30 years to see what has changed, because that would definitely has changed. But in a certain sense, that's what I meant when I say trying to do, and I was talking to one of your colleagues earlier about this, a kind of conjunctural analysis. What were the questions that were being asked in 1976 when we borrowed from that museum is very different from the questions that are being asked now. What are the pressure points that are being placed on institutions are very different now than that was being asked then. And so if one were to think of these different temporal moments as different pressure points where different questions and answers are given, then one would say, yes, I think younger conservators are growing up in a time of, like now, where the word decolonization is being used when it wouldn't have been used differently. That said, that's what I mean by we need new concepts, because I don't know how many of you here will still be invited to go over to somewhere in Jamaica to build capacity, because there is a language that is still embedded which suggests that we know here and over there needs to know. And so even while there is change, we are sometimes conceptually stuck in a certain understanding of the world that needs to shift. And so we need to also push the categories, because some of them are just so exhausted that they have no more utility. And we have to think, why do they have less capacity than I do? So I think that it is double-sided in that sense for me, anyway.
Thank you all. I know there are more questions, but we will have the opportunity to talk outside in the reception. Thank you all for coming, and thank you as well. And that was an exciting panel. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.